In a class of language learning, the textbook becomes the primary focal point of education. Clayton Croy's book on Greek has virtually everything we will need to wrap our minds around the Greek language and think about how it all fits together. And I regard my role more as that of a commentator and facilitator. To point out, for example, perhaps the more salient features of the textbook, the things I really want to be sure are underscored in your minds. Occasionally to provide a corrective to what we find in the textbook, or at least some alternative views of the grammar being presented, and largely to supplement what Croy is giving you in his primer. And so in this foundational lecture, as indeed in many of the presentations that I will be posting for this online class, what we will be looking at together as I speak will be the textbook itself. And I will work through the lesson and use its format as the basis for my own commentary, as it were, on Greek grammar and the vocabulary, and just helping you put together what you find in the printed page, hopefully, helpfully. And then, of course, we will continue to come together so that we can discuss any lingering questions that you might have, any points of confusion, or any requests for more information for further study or whatever. I had asked you to use some time prior to class, prior to the beginning of our first week together, to become comfortable with the Greek alphabet, even to the point where you could sound out Greek letters, Greek words, and the squiggles would become actual building blocks of language for you. And ideally, we could start together then in our first week of classes with that foundation laid, so that you're able to focus really on the new grammar week by week and the forms that you have to learn, without also at the same time thinking, oh, is that a gamma or is that a delta? What is that letter? What sound does that make? And things like that. Nevertheless, I realize that even if you did begin early, you may still encounter some points of confusion, and we will, of course, work as closely as we can together to make sure that that the alphabet, that the sounds are solidified as quickly as possible, even as we are picking up some of these initial building blocks together this week and next. Now, just a few things to highlight about the alphabet and its pronunciation. First, please pay close attention to the fact that there are two E vowels and two O vowels in Greek. One is short, epsilon, the other is long, eta, and the very names of these letters, epsilon and eta, reflect the difference in this pronunciation, e versus a. Similarly, there is omicron and omega. Omicron and omega. Once again, the initial sounds of the letters, of the letter names, giving us the sound of the letter itself. In the case of these O-class vowels, the very names give us the Greek equivalent of short O, mikron being the Greek word for small, or little, small o, and long O, mega being the Greek word for big or great. So we have the little o and the great O, the short O and the long O in English idiom. The difference in pronunciation is important because the spelling of a Greek word is always very important. And I want your speech and the sounds you hear in your head as you begin to look at Greek words to reinforce the correct spelling. Not only would it change the meaning of a word in many cases to think of an omega in place of an omicron, but it also will change the kind of verb or the kind of noun we might be looking at. The difference in some cases between a present tense verb and a past tense verb is a difference between an epsilon and an eta sound at the outset. The difference between a regular old verb that is the kind of verb we'd use in telling a story, the difference between that kind of verb and a more complex kind of verb, like a verb indicating purpose or encouraging people to action, could be the difference between an omicron sound and an omega sound. So we do want to pay attention to these differences in the vowels. Just one other note, perhaps on the order of petulant notes, but what the heck. These letters, although if you're familiar with Greek, with fraternities at colleges and what have you, you would ordinarily see these as phi, chi, and psi, but the letters are actually pronounced phi, chi, and psi in Greek. First, because the iota, that I vowel, iota, is an E sound, most often like the I in police. And then, of course, the second of these three letters, the chi, is not ki, it's not kai, but chi, it's that guttural K sound that we just don't have in English, at least, not unless we have bronchitis or something, but is common in other languages like German. Ich, chi. So then, a few other little points here. Yes, transliteration. This column here provides you with the ways in which Greek letters can be represented in English, and it's good for us to become familiar with systems of transliteration. First, because it helps us learn how to pronounce these words, but second, and probably more importantly, older resources often, not always, but often, are published by presses that don't use Greek fonts, or, in the case of older resources, Greek typesets. So everything is printed in transliteration. So you could be reading along in an older journal article or commentary, and you'll come across a reference to a Greek word, but they won't be using Greek letters. They'll be using this a system of transliteration, which in many cases is quite obvious. But notice, for example, that the eta is represented by an E with a long mark over the top, a little line over the E representing a long vowel, distinguishing it from the epsilon, which has no such line. Similarly, the omega is represented by an O with a macron, a line over it, distinguishing it from the omicron. One oddity, actually two oddities in transliteration. First, upsilon is often transliterated with the U, which I think we would expect, but is often also transliterated with a Y instead. I've actually, frankly, forgotten the rule for that. Can't pull it out of my head right now. But just be aware that sometimes the upsilon shows up in English transliteration as the letter Y. A famous example of this is in the Greek phrase Kyrie eleison, which, if you are in a liturgically inclined church at all, you probably would have encountered. It is the Greek Greek phrase for Lord, have mercy. The Kyrie there comes from the Greek word kurios, which is actually spelled kappa upsilon, but in English it's represented by ky as opposed to ku. The other thing to notice is that sometimes, when the letter rho begins a word, it is not transliterated merely with R, but transliterated with RH, as in the word rhetoric, which comes from a Greek word rhetorike, rhetorical, So just be aware of some oddities of transliteration. Now, we'll come to a little more explanation of that in just a moment. First, it's always good to know what your vowels are. They're just like English, A, E, I, O, U, except there are two options for E and two options for O sounds. Very often, you will encounter two vowels next to each other that actually function as a single sound together. These are called diphthongs. The word diphthong comes from Greek, a Greek word meaning two, and another word meaning sound. Phongos is the Greek word for sound. Not a particularly attractive word. Anyway, diphthong, two sounds, join together to create a single sound that creates only one syllable as opposed to two syllables. So if you see alpha and iota next to each other, it's more than likely that it's not going to be pronounced A-I, but rather I. Epsilon and iota will not be pronounced E-I, but simply A. So these two sounds lump together into a single sound cluster. You'll also encounter, as we work through even lessons 2 and 3, you'll find a strange letter combination, the vowels alpha, eta, or omega, with a little tiny iota written underneath that vowel. That is a vestigial diphthong. It appears to have dropped out of pronunciation but been retained in writing. And actually in inscriptions and some other places where Greek is only written in capitals, the iota is in fact retained on the main line next to the alpha, eta, or omega. But by the time of the Hellenistic period, it's become a vestigial sound. Hence, we don't pronounce these differently, but we do bear in mind that these little iota subscripts are there because, again, the presence or absence of that little mark will very often help us determine the meaning of a word or the person and number of a verb, or what usage a noun is having. All of that will make far more sense after we get through lessons 2 and 3. Just bear in mind that that little tiny mark can be very important. Another set of marks not to ignore are what are called breathing marks. Smooth and rough breathing marks, which basically correspond to our single quote marks. The closing single quote mark marks a smooth breathing in Greek. The opening single quote mark denotes a rough breathing, and these will stand directly over a vowel or the second vowel of a diphthong. The smooth breathing does nothing to alter the pronunciation of a word. It is the rough breathing that adds something important, and it adds simply the sound that our letter H makes at the beginning of a word. The breath, as in hello. And that rough breathing then, in effect, acts as a consonant in Greek, and very often two words are distinguished from one another in Greek simply by the presence or absence of that rough breathing, of that letter H sound at the beginning of a word. So when a Greek word begins with a vowel or diphthong with a rough breathing mark, that is even transliterated into English when that word is represented in English with an H at the beginning. The difference in these examples, the word N, you can see there's no rough breathing, and the word hen with a rough breathing, distinguished really only by the presence or absence of that rough breathing mark. N is the preposition in, I-N in English. Hen is the Greek number 1. That's quite a difference that an H sound makes. One last oddity here. The letter rho, when it begins a word, gets a rough breathing, because apparently Greeks liked to put a little bit of breath into their opening R sounds. So you'll always find this strange rough breathing mark over an initial rho in a word, suggesting that it was pronounced more like HR, chretor, chretor, as opposed to simply retor. Of course, in transliteration, this has ended up being represented as RH, not HR. If it had gone HR, many of our English words, from rhetoric to rheumatology, would be spelled differently. Clayton Croy's book begins to talk about how to break up a Greek word into syllables here. We won't really pay too much attention to this just yet. It is helpful for pronunciation, but ultimately, to do it reliably, you need to kind of know what consonant clusters can begin a word in Greek, so you know how to break up a word. Excuse me there. So we only know that this is a, pa, sta, as opposed to a, pos, ta, because we know that many Greek words can begin with sigma tau as a consonant cluster. So to really deal with this well, we need to have a good exposure to some Greek vocabulary. All that really is important for us at this point is to know that the last three syllables of any Greek word are the syllables which might take an accent if the Greek word has an accent, and almost all Greek words do. So as we talk about accent in Greek words, we'll want to be able to look at and divide well the last three syllables, which do have very fancy names. The last one is called the ultima. That's pretty intuitive because ultimate tends to mean last. The second to last is called the penult, which is just a shortened form of penultima, from the Latin word pine ultima, pina meaning almost, so the almost last syllabus. And antepenultima, kind of shortened to antepenult, is the before, the before the next to last syllable. So three great vocabulary words that you can throw out in a sentence and alienate your hearers. Oh, did you hear that speaker's penultimate thought? And then they're like, huh? What? Like syllabification, accents are something probably best discussed more in the context of actual Greek words and word paradigms. For now, let's just remember that Greek words do tend to have an accent, just like English words tend to have a stress, one syllable that is stressed over the others. And in fact, in common practice, we don't give Greek accents the value they once had, which is more musical value. We give it the value that stressed syllables have in English. So when you see an accent over a word, it's okay just to punch that syllable that's accented a little bit more than its neighbors. That's what we do with English, and that's a little bit more natural. Sometimes noting accent is very important because it is, in fact, the accent that will distinguish two words, one from the other. And the rules of accentuation that appear here, really not things that you need to commit to memory or anything right now. The importance of these rules is that they help us understand why in different forms of the same Greek word, like apostolos, in different forms of apostolos, why that accent might jump from the third to last syllable, the antepenult, to the second to last syllable, the penult. So rather than simply be confused by that or mystified by it, knowing a little bit of the basic rules of accentuation can explain that for us. Again, we'll talk about that in our discussion of lessons 2 and 3 when we begin to see some patterns of words where this would begin to be applied. Please don't overlook the small marks, the punctuation. Greek used a comma and a period, much as we do, but it had a different punctuation mark than we've ever used before. This raised period is the Greek colon, or semicolon, and what we use as a semicolon is their question mark. So when you see a sentence ending in a what looks in English like a semicolon, don't be confused. Remember, Greeks don't have semicolons colas like we do. They use this for a question mark. Now, already you've spent time practicing writing the Greek alphabet, hopefully practicing transliterating Greek, specifically the two passages that I put in the pre-class work, John 1, 1-4, and the Lord's Prayer from Matthew 6, and even spent some time trying to pronounce Greek using the audio that I recorded into those PowerPoint presentations to help you begin to make this into meaningful sounds that could eventually become a meaningful language for you. You could practice it a little bit more if you were inclined this week on the passage from Genesis 1, 1-4. We might even have time to do this in our tutorial session together. Notice, just by the way, that John has begun his gospel with exactly the same string of sounds, the same two words, as the Greek version of Genesis 1, the creation story, which already says a lot about John's theology of who Jesus is. Indeed, one of the things that very much attracts me to Croy's grammar is the fact that he gives a lot of attention to the Septuagint, the early Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And so he will often give exercises not only from the New Testament, but also from the Old Testament, in the form of the Old Testament as it was used by many diaspora Jews, from Egypt to Syria to Asia Minor to Greece to Italy, all the places where Greek was spoken and Jews separated from their homeland for generations would be in danger of losing Hebrew, and in fact did quite early on lose facility in Hebrew. So to meet their needs, the Hebrew scriptures were translated by bilingual Jewish scribes into Greek, giving us the Old Testament that would have been the most widely used text type in the early church, which of course grew mainly in the diaspora. And if it had roots in the Jewish community, it was mainly in Greek-speaking Jewish synagogues across the diaspora. So important is the Septuagint that, in addition to Croy's brief introduction, I've put up a presentation, about a 45 minute presentation on the Septuagint, its origins, its nature, its importance for understanding early Judaism, and especially the New Testament and the world of early Christianity, which I commend to you for your viewing. This brings us through most of the material, all the material really, in Lesson 1 of Croy's textbook, which lays the most basic building blocks for all of our work together as we move from trying to pronounce Greek to trying to understand Greek and read Greek, beginning in our next lesson with a look at the Greek verb system and our very first set of Greek paradigms. How did Greeks talk about active action in the present time? We will look at that together in our next video.